We finished up last Wednesday night dealing with some things that dealt with the birth of Jesus, and we're going to finish that up tonight. We'll see if we go any further and with that. But just want to remind you that Luke told us in Acts 17, when he talked about Paul going out there and preaching, that the Berean Jews were of more noble character than those in Thessalonica, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the Scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. And that again is the goal that we should all have in mind, is that once we hear something, to go and to do the searching ourselves as well, if at all possible. It's difficult if you don't have a Bible, or the Bible's not in your language, or if you can't read at all. And for centuries, there were people in this situation. So we really don't quite appreciate how fantastic of an era that we live in. That for most of us, we're educated. We can read. Might not be able to do math as good, but we can read. And then the Bible is so easily obtainable that instead of going to the book form, now it's on our phones, on our iPads, on our computers, and that's a good thing. The Word is the Word. It's not the written pages that make the Word. It's the Word of God that is the Word. And that's why John said in John chapter 1, in the beginning was the Word, or Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. You don't have to have paper to have the Word. It sure does help in a lot of situations. But the Word is to dwell within our hearts. And I just wanted to bring out that statement. And by the way, in this era that we live in, if I want to see a different translation, and I'm hoping to have a lesson on translations just a little bit later on, but if I want to see what the New King James Version, how it words it, how the New International Version words it, how the Revised American Standard Version words it, it's all there. I just got to click a little icon, and I can see the different translations and how they approach the interpretation of the Scriptures. It's a wonderful thing in helping to understand. And we'll be looking at that issue in one of the things that we're dealing with tonight. So, we never got truly to the wise men except to ask you the question, how many wise men were there? And y'all were very, very smart from the very start by saying, we don't know. So I had to ask you, well, what does everybody else say? And 3. Just like this picture, it shows there's only 3 wise men, and they just happen to be riding camels, don't they, in this thing? And it amazes me. Even the Scriptures, well, let's just go to the Scriptures, okay? Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Remember that verse, we're coming back to it. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. So they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet, but you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. When they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And you see that I kind of underlined that. That's another important scripture. Same passage, different translation. This is the New Revised Standard Version. And Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod. Magi from the east came to Jerusalem. If you look at the original Greek, the word that is used here is more appropriately translated magi rather than wise men. And I remember growing up and not really knowing much of anything and saying, well, there were 3 wise men. Why do you call them magi? Who are the magi? Not even knowing that this is the more proper translation for us to be looking at. And so I asked the question, who are the magi? Notice there is nothing about the number of them. So we've already taken that. How many wise men there were? We don't know. But since it was plural, there had to be at least 2. And I don't think 2 would be enough, so I think there's at least 3. And there could be several more, possibly up to 12, though there's nothing to tell us how many there were there, except that they were there, according to Matthew. And it's interesting. Only Matthew mentions the Magi. Only Matthew. Have you thought about it? When it comes to the birth of Christ, only Matthew mentions the story of the Magi coming. Now, we're told by John that if he wrote everything down that Jesus did, the world couldn't contain the books. I understand that. So they had to be efficient on what they wrote for us to read. And so what they wrote should take much of our attention as to why they wrote it. They wanted us to be aware of it, to notice it. So why did Matthew write about the Magi when no one else did? There's got to be some importance to that. And when I last taught this 10 years ago, when I asked about how many wise men there were, I spent a minute, maybe a minute and a half on it and said, here's the scripture, look at it. We don't know the number, and I went on. It was just more of introduction. Tonight is totally different from that. Because as I was working on these lessons again, I thought a question, why is it mentioned by Matthew? Is there something there that we need to try to glean? And yet the scripture is very limited in what it tells us. But the good Lord gave us the sense to go back and to look and to see things and to learn about manners and customs, to learn about history and see how things are connected. And from my study, I saw in my mind, how certain things connected. So I'm actually wanting to do a deep dive on the wise men. Has anybody ever heard a minister preach on nothing but the wise men, period? If you have, raise your hand. I've never heard that, but why? Because there's just not much you can say, right? Unless you start digging. And you fill in the story, that thing that goes around, and perhaps that will give you some greater understanding. So what I want to do tonight is look at 3 things. I want to look at Herod, because he's a main character here with the wise men, right? And I want to look at the Magi, and I will use Magi and wise men interchangeably. And I want to look at the Parthian Empire. And you're going to say, what? What? Well, I hope at the end of the class you won't be saying so much what, but it would encourage you to go and to do some additional study. Now, we know that having read this story about the wise men, the Magi coming in, we realize that this one kind of centers around Herod in the start, and we know that he becomes the person who massacres innocents, right? In the end, he winds up killing everyone 2 years old and younger, correct? And there's great weeping and wailing from this. So Herod was not a nice guy. But he was the first Herod, the first king. He was the Herod who was the first Herod king of Judea. And he started what would be called the Herodian Empire because his son would take over later. And therefore, since you have two Herods, you've got an empire going on, such as it was, right? But this man Herod, we just see this mean old guy who evidently is very selfish and self-centered, who does this dastardly deed of just wiping out all these babies to make sure that he can get the one called Jesus. If you don't know who he is, let's just canvass the area and take them all out. It's just amazing. But then I thought, okay, but who is Herod? Why is he mentioned? Well, we know part of why he's mentioned because of what he did in trying to destroy Jesus. But Herod being the first, I'm going to say Jewish king tongue-in-cheek, he plays a significant role. He was called Herod the Great. And you say, well, he probably was great only that he was a legend in his own mind. That would not be true. Well, he was a legend in his own mind, but that's not why he was called Herod the Great. He was a man who came into Judea, and he built big cities, and he built colossal buildings, and he helped in the rebuilding of the second temple that was built. So he did a lot of things in this respect. But why did he get to be where he is? Because even though he practiced the Jewish religion or was brought up under the Jewish religion, let me say, he was not a true Jew. We know that you come from the seed of Abraham down to Isaac, and then who? Jacob, right? He didn't come that way. He came from Abraham down to Isaac through the other guy, Esau. He was an Edomite, or what you would call Idumean. Now, I don't claim to pronounce all these names correctly. You're welcome to go look them up and do some studying. But what happened was his father was Antipater, or Antipater, however way you want to pronounce it that. But Antipater was this Idumean, a descendant through Esau. And in this, his father was a friend to General Pompey. General Pompey would come down and he would take over the Hasmonean Empire for Rome and allow Rome to now have the empire, the Judea, to be under the watchful eye of Rome. It was quite interesting that he would do that. But because he sided with the Romans liked him, right? The reason that he was under the Jewish part is that earlier on, you've heard about the Maccabean revolt. Well, the Maccabean revolt led into the Hasmonean Empire. And basically in that, the Hasmonean Empire was the Maccabeans were tired of the Jews being moved away, contaminated by Hellenistic views. Well, you say, what do you mean by that? Well, a Jew was supposed to be pure, right? You know the lineage that you come through and from all that. And you're supposed to do things a certain way. You're supposed to wear certain clothing. You're supposed to do this. You're supposed to do that. The Hellenistics were very much influenced by the Greeks. And they began to adopt more of their traditions and customs. And the Maccabees did not like that. They did not like being under the rule of the Seleucid Empire at this time. And so they revolted and took over. But something interesting happened when they were able to take over Judea there for a while. That began the Hasmonean Empire. But they did something differently in that for the only time that I think that we have recorded, they forced everyone in Judea to become a Jew. Now, I met a rabbi up in Gettysburg many years ago. We took a motorcycle trip up there on the hottest week of the summer of whatever. It was toasty, but I was outside the hotel trying to cool off, and a Jewish rabbi, had been visiting the area. Had the long things coming from his head, the hair and all, and had the hat on and all this. And I actually had a nice conversation with him. We talked about some things. And one thing that he told me about the Jewish faith, he says, we do not try to convert people to become Jews. Now, if they want to become a Jew, or, start practicing the faith, they're more than welcome. But we don't go out as our mission to convert people over to the Jewish faith. I thought that quite interesting because it's just the opposite of what we do, especially talking about the door knocking this Saturday. But this one time, so that's their philosophy, but this one time the Maccabees said, if you're in this area, you're going to be a Jew. So Herod's father had to practice the Jewish faith, and Herod himself was brought up under it. So he was raised as a Jew, though he wasn't what we would truly classify as a Jew, more of a proselyte. These are the interesting things that begin to take place. But at some point in time, when Pompey comes down and he takes over Judea with the help of Herod's father, you get rewarded, right? You're friends of the Roman, they appreciate what you did. And so he was then, Herod's father was given a place of honor in governance over a certain area. And for Herod, his son, he became tetrarch of Judea. Not king, but tetrarch. Well, what happens is that you have a former Hasmonean who wants to come over and take back control from Rome. And so he comes. But he needs some help. And he gets some help from the Parthians that are east of Israel. And they are able to take over. And the person that they had, so the Parthians put a Hasmonean back in power, and Herod runs off to Rome. Now you think he's running scared, but he's a brilliant man. At this time, he says, I can use this to my advantage. And he goes before the Senate and he said, we need to get these people back out of Judea. They're a thorn in the side to the Romans. And so we find that Mark Antony comes down with soldiers. And finally, after about 3 years, pushes them out. But while Herod is in Rome, and there's already a king that had been established by the Parthians, who is a Hasmonean, those who practice let's say the conservative Jewish faith, the Roman Senate proclaims Herod at the same time king of Judea. But he's estranged. He's away from Judea, and you've got the Judean king. Well, once Mark Antony comes down, and that's the Mark Antony with Cleopatra, that you watch movies about. After they clear that out, and then he takes over as king. But there's some people not happy with him because they know that he's in the favor of their oppressors, the Romans. And so I guess you would say he divorces his first wife and child and pushes them back up to the to Rome. And he takes a new wife, Mariamne, who is a Hasmonean princess. And back during these days, you would marry someone in some other empire to form alliances. So he thought that this would help make the people of Judea accept him in a better way. And in some instances it worked. Now I also understand that this new wife was a very beautiful lady, but she was devout in her faith. And you always kind of think of, well, if Herod's bad, his wife's got to be bad, right? But not the case. Later on, he would kill his wife and the sons that he had through her as he became deranged and was afraid that they would overtake his kingdom. See, the problem with power is you're always afraid that someone's going to take that power away from you, right? Always afraid. And that weighed on him, became more and more paranoid. So we get to the point now that he's in Jerusalem. He is the king. By the way, Mark Antony goes into the Parthian Empire and he says, hey, I think I can just conquer them again. And it doesn't work. And he comes back in shame. Now he tries to make it sound like, well, at least I withstood them. But at that point in time, people, you need to understand, it told the existing world that the Romans were no longer infallible. They could be beaten because they made the oppression to go into Parthia and to take over, and they failed. They failed from that. So that's an important part. So Rome is kind of looking at Parthia, and by the way, Parthian Empire was a big empire that lasted for over 400 years. And when we think of Rome, we think, well, that's all there was. Parthia was over there to the east. China. And they were responsible for the trade that would go from Italy all the way over to China. They called that the Silk Trail, right? From that. So all these things are going on at this time when Herod is. And so at this point, Herod's there at the grace of the Romans, but because of his cunning, and he's afraid that someone's going to take over. He's done a lot of good things for the people. He's done bad things for the people. And then all of a sudden the Magi come in. And we go back and look at this. And it says that when the Magi come in, he was disturbed. He was disturbed. But who else was disturbed? All of Jerusalem in verse 3 there. Now, I can understand why Herod was disturbed. Somebody's in on my territory. What's going on? And later on, when they tell him, hey, there's going to be, we come to see the new king, that's understandable. He hadn't yet been told that. He's all concerned up in the air because he's heard the Magi are there. And not only him, but all of Jerusalem. Why? Well, it goes back to who the Magi were. The Magi comes from a word that simply translated for some would be magician, but they were Zoroastrian priests from way back, generation after generation within the Persian Empire. They were astronomers, astrologers, wise men, counselors to the kings. They were highly respected and were given great honor. Yeah. So it just wasn't three guys who happened to have some good things, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, and they were smart guys, and this happened. When they came, they may have been escorted by the Parthian soldiers. We don't know that. But if you do the studying in it, you realize when they traveled, when a Magi traveled, it's recorded that one particular Magi, when he traveled with 1,000 camels. Which meant he had a lot of people backing him up to protect him because he had a lot to protect. Now, again, these empires coexisted together. And again, it just wasn't Rome. You had the Parthian in there. And now we see that Rome and Parthian had kind of bantered back and forth. One tried to defeat the other. Sometimes they'd win, sometimes you'd lose. But they had reached the point, they say, let bygones be bygones. We need to trade. We need to get things from China. Let's just be peaceful and respect each other. But when the Parthians came into Israel, which they did, or into Judea, which they did, they would often come in with an accompaniment. It's kind of like Abraham. We think of Abraham that he's got Sarah and he's got Lot, his nephew, and maybe a couple other people, and that's all he had when he left his home and went toward the land of Canaan. If you read, you find out that he was very wealthy, had a lot of servants then and all, and it was probably a pretty huge entourage. But if all of a sudden you find magi, these people of great renown and respect, all of a sudden showing up in your city with soldiers or other people, you're going to wonder, what in the world's going on here? I was never notified of this. That's why he was not only concerned, but all of Jerusalem was concerned, because they probably came with a sizable entourage. And so, yeah, we're concerned. Or could this be a battle? What's going on? So they come to Jerusalem after following the star. Now, we've got to realize Bethlehem's about 6 miles away south of Jerusalem. So they're within the area. But they're looking for the King of Kings, the new king to be born. As I said, they were astrologers. And back then, these Zoroastrian priests looked at that if you had a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, Jupiter represented the new king, and Saturn represented the old king. And as they came in alignment, it meant that a king was getting ready to be replaced. And so if they may have seen this conjunction, and then that's why they said, hey, we have a prophecy that talks about a God king that would be born, that would rule over all. And this stuff had probably been passed down from generation to generation. And you know who passed it down? Daniel. Daniel. Do you remember what Nebuchadnezzar did for Daniel? And do you remember when Belshazzar, his son, saw the writing on the wall? The disembodied hand, and was writing, and his own wise men, his own magi, could not interpret it? His wife came to him and said, listen, you've got someone that can tell you what's going on. Your father made him chief of the magi. Did you realize that Daniel was made chief of the magi? It's in Daniel chapter 2. So Daniel, this highly respected person who came in as a prisoner and rose to be, number 3 within Nebuchadnezzar's, well, I think Belshazzar made him number 3 in that, but rose up kind of like Joseph did, in the Egyptian bondage, so much that he is placed over all the other magi. Would they not have gleaned from him? And then what he taught of the prophecies of the coming of the Messiah been passed down to them. Now, the Zoroastrians believed in one God. They believed in the resurrection. They were not Jews, but these are the things that they believed. And so when Daniel started talking to them, think about those things being passed down from generation to generation of these learned men. And all of a sudden, one day, someone says, Daniel told us when this was going to happen. He spells it out for us when the Messiah will come. And they looked and they said, it's time. So now they've got a mission. That's why they traveled 800 to 1,000 miles. So they come in, and Herod knows that they have come in, traveling that far with their entourage. What in the world's going on? Well, if you're looking for a king, where's the first place you go? Castle, palace, right? So they went to the palace. And it's ironic that Herod is saying, remember, he's brought up under the Jews, but that's not his main thing. And he says, what do you want? What are you here for? We're here to see the king, the new king. I don't have a child. There's nobody. right here to take over for me. Not that he didn't have a child at that time. I should correct that. And he's bewildered because he does not know the writing of the Old Testament scriptures. And so he tells, you can see him telling the Magi, would you just kind of go into this room and we'll serve you and wait on you and take care of you? I'll be right back. So he gets his own wise men. He says, what is going on here? And then they tell him, the prophecy. The King of Kings will be born in Bethlehem. Herod didn't know it, but he should have. He hadn't studied the scriptures, right? And so now he's really incensed. If this is all the fulfillment, it has to be something unbelievable because these magi have come. And we know what he does. He goes out and he says, yeah, when the new king was not there, they asked, well, where is he? And so then Herod comes out and he says, it's in Bethlehem. Just go to Bethlehem. And when you find him, come tell me and I'll go worship him. Very conniving man. And we know what happens in that era, do we not? So we have Herod brought up under the Jewish faith, but because of his father's treaty, let's say, partnership with the Romans, he becomes a favored person of the Romans and is placed as king of Judea because they have confidence in him, because they believe that since his father helped, this will be a good thing for them. And at the same time, he's saying, how can I hold on to power? So what would have happened if these people came in and were not happy or treated right? That would get back to Rome. Rome's trying to remain peaceful with the Parthian Empire. And what if that had destroyed it all? So you could understand what's going on in his mind. But then we know the rest of the story. They go into Bethlehem and they find Jesus just born, right? That's what it says in that verse 11. They find Jesus just born. I see, that's the other myth, right? No, he's not just born. He's in a house now. No longer in a manger. He's in a house. So it's been some time. We're not sure exactly how much time it's been. So the nativity scene that shows the shepherds, at the manger and the magi next to him is not true. It's a myth. They were not there on the night of Jesus' birth. But then I think, again, here they come in, and it's all because probably from their connection with Daniel, who prophesied about coming of the Messiah. And that came down because, remember, it said that all nations would be blessed by this king. And so since the Zoroastrians believed in the one God, whether it's the one God that the Jewish people believed is not certain. I couldn't get anything definitive on that. But they believed that there was only one supreme being, and they did believe in the resurrection. But they're tying it together. So someone from the east, a Persian, has to come in and be the first one to say, hey, we see the signs. We saw the prophecy come to pass, and we're here to see the fulfillment of it. It wasn't a Jew. It was someone in a far-off land. Think about it. As the world is being pulled together to show that Jesus Christ was and is truly the King of Kings, that people that had nothing to do with the Jews and yet did because of their connection with Daniel are now all coming together. This was too much for Herod to handle, was it not? And we do know later on that after he massacres the children, that he actually, after he kills his wife and his two sons that through her, he tries to commit suicide, but he's not good at it. He fails. But he dies thereafter. And by, they say, around 4 A.D., he's dead and replaced by his son, Herod Antipas. So it's just, when you look at it, and where did the Parthians come in? Well, they kept the Roman Empire in check. And it's because of their power that allowed these magi to come into the territory with great respect and get an audience before the king. Because not everyone that walked to the palace and said, I want to see the king, got to see the king. These were great, learned men. And we've got to see, they just weren't wise men. They were men of high position. And it was not uncommon for them that once a kingdom had a son that was born to become a new king, that they would make pilgrimage to that area and to present gifts. Thus the gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And you can talk about those gifts and what they might mean. But I remember when all of a sudden, Joseph is warned, you got to get up and get out of here. Herod's out of control. You got to go. And we know where he went, right? Egypt. Okay, what did he live on? He was a carpenter. What was going to make that journey? That's right, Rita. The gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I can see them selling that, right? And trading it or whatever. So those gifts that were given to signify him as King of the Kings by the Magi could very well have been used to allow him to go safely and quietly into Egypt, where he would remain safe and then come back and eventually, wind up in Nazareth. So that's a lot of talking. There are more names and dates than what I can remember. And I was afraid that if I said too many of them, I would just wind up being too tedious. But I would encourage you to go study. This is something that started with a misconception. But then you want to search and say, well, why is this? So why did Matthew bring in the Magi? I think that it's because of their association with the East, the Parthian Empire, their connection with Daniel. And that's my supposition, okay? And that they were proclaiming, yes, the King of Kings is here. Whew. One quick thing I want to share with you. My stamina is not as good as it has been lately. I told you that in October we had a pre-planned camping trip that we were going on. I assume we're still going to try and make that. But I had a little thing to happen to me, and I just wanted to let you know about it because it could affect my class, and because some of you finding out about it later, you might want to ask, why didn't you tell me sooner? Friday, I had surgery. Outpatient surgery. If you came close to me, you'd see a 1-inch incision on the right side of my face with stitches. That was basal cell carcinoma, which is not too bad, right? It's a slow-growing skin cancer. But what you can't see underneath this collar is a 4-inch gash where they took out a huge strip of skin from me because they found what is called Merkel cell carcinoma. It's a rare cancer that affects only 3 out of 1 million people. My mother always said I was special. I just didn't know it would be this way. Unfortunately, it's an aggressive cancer. I don't know how long I've had it. We are still waiting for the test results to come back, and we are hope to have those no later than Tuesday of next week. So I've been sleeping a lot here lately, but I had enough energy today to come in to speak with you. I appreciate your diligence with me. I'm fine, I'm just now starting to get back. At the end of this week, I get to get back into lifting things and things like that. So everything's well. We just don't know if it's spread or not. If it's spread, it's not a good thing. But hopefully we got it early, and we will let you know once we know and see whatever further procedures they might have to do. But I covet your prayers, of course, and your thoughts from that. Truly believe in that. I'm kind of quiet on things about you. Mike will tell you that, and so will Ron and Angie. But I just thought if I get low of energy, I'm going to do my best to be here from here on out. But just in case, you will understand why. So didn't mean to end on such a low note, but I've got a great nurse because of the good things I said about women last Wednesday night played over. It's been a very good week. She has taken care of me all the way. So that is it, and thank you so much for being here tonight.